Good morning. So we're going to be speaking about a lot of science. So I'd like us just to cheer up a little bit, okay? Because you look scared. Yeah, so please cheer up. It's going to be fun, I promise. Right. Good morning once again. My name is Bonnie Tunya. I work for CNBC Africa. We tell African financial stories on the continent. And today I'm excited to talk about a topic that is very close to my heart. Now, the ladies and gentlemen on the panel here are all smarter than me, right? Because they're all doctors. Nah. So I'll try to dumb down all the information they do have and try to connect with what we are trying to do on the ground. Is that okay? Great. So we'll spend the next 60 minutes trying to wrap our minds around the question of laying the groundwork for research and innovation on the continent. We've all agreed that there is need to make better decisions on the continent. We all are agreeable to the fact that evidence-based decision-making is needed yesterday on the continent. However, I'd like just to throw a few worrying numbers and stats at you. At the moment, Africa's investment in R&D stands at less than 1% of the GDP. This needs to concern us greatly, because if indeed we're going to match into the future that we talk about, if Africa is going to match into the fourth industrial revolution, then we need to have better tools of making these decisions. We need to have a better architecture of how we do this. And so I'd like to propose a few questions for the next 60 minutes that we'll consider. And that is, how can government and business leaders focus on and foster viable Pan-African research and innovation within the ecosystems in which we do operate? So without much ado, allow me to introduce my panel. Like I said, their profiles go into 2 or 3 pages, so I will not go through all that. They are well-established people. In order of what I have here, because it's a lot, I'd like to first introduce Korisha Abdul Karim. She is a professor of epidemiology at the Columbia University Medical Center in the USA. A round of applause will be good at this point. Thank you very much. Next, the gentleman right next to me, Thomas Kariuki, Director for African Academy of Sciences in Kenya. Thank you. Next to Thomas, yeah, all these pages are all just for Thomas, right? Iqbal Sav is the Executive Chairman for the Sekunjalo in South Africa. And a man whose name I can't pronounce, Roger Furis, who is the Executive Director for the Global Development at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, USA. Right, and last but certainly not least, Dr. Tolu Oni, Associate Professor of Division of Public Health Medicine, School of Public Health at the University of Cape Town, right here in South Africa. Thank you very much for making time to be part of this conversation. Just a quick housekeeping is that we will have a session where we want to engage with what you think. We want your reactions to the submissions that my panel would make. And so I will, at a later stage, have the microphone roving. So if you have that burning question, do not go away with it. Just put it down. I will give you all a chance to address that. Is that okay? Great. So let's just jump into this conversation, ladies and gentlemen. And we spent quite a few moments behind there already having quite an engaging conversation. But I'd like Kariuki to just set the scene for us. We talk about an Africa that is marching forward, but our decision-making is not as informed. Just paint to us a picture of where we are as far as research and innovation goes on the continent.
Well, that's... that could take a whole day, but...
Take 5 minutes.
Okay. I think there is, for me, I think the journey has been one where I've seen over the years progressively a recognition of the place of science, technology, and innovation in our socio-economic development. That was not always the argument many years ago, but increasingly, if you look at some of the strategies, including economic strategies that many governments put out today, they actually do say very clearly that one of the pillars for socio-economic development is investments in science, technology, and innovation. And that has been, for me, one of the transformations I have seen across the continent, that recognition. They may not be putting money into it as yet, but the intentions are very clear that that's the way to go. The African Academy of Sciences, we've been around for 30 years, based in Nairobi, but having a Pan-African outlook and also having a reach across many partners, both in Africa and globally. And we are a knowledge-driven organization that really has been supporting programs across the continent, in all sciences, in all knowledge. The recognition that to solve Africa's socioeconomic challenges, you actually need to harness all the knowledge, all the sciences, not just one aspect. In the last 2 years, we put together this platform that I lead called AESA, the Alliance for Accelerating Excellence in Science in Africa, which is a partnership of the Academy and NEPAD agency, and with the support of global partners, including the Gates Foundation, DFID, and Wellcome, to actually begin to really invest in some of the key issues that support research and innovation. So if the question is, where are we? Where we are is a scenario where, one, we don't have the critical mass, whether it's a critical mass in terms of the people, researchers and innovators, because if you look at the numbers, you see we have something like less than 170 scientists and innovators per million inhabitants. That's the lowest in the world, so basically we are 20 to 30 times less than, say, Europe or the US in terms of those numbers. We don't have a critical mass of centers of excellence. At the end of the day, what you need is people, but you also need places that can actually generate the sort of environments that will engender research and innovation to emerge out of that. And so we also need to build lots of research and development environments, innovation hubs across the continent to get to that critical mass. Thirdly, we actually are not attracting young people as we should be in terms of bringing them into the fold and getting them into career pathways that really sort of, again, support that vision of having science-led development. So the number of young people who choose career pathways in research is very low. In fact, if you look at the undergraduate levels in our universities, we have 3 times less the number of people who should be, compared to the global average, 3 times the number of people getting into graduate school compared to the rest of the world. And fourthly, I think we have so many gaps in terms of some of the critical areas we need to fill, whether it is standards, whether it is ethics of doing research, whether it is research management, whether it is scientific leadership. There are all kinds of gaps that we need to fill before we can actually then have the promise. But I think the bottom line is that if we are going to meet the targets for SDGs, we need to address all of these issues. We missed the boat a bit with the MDGs. There's an opportunity to apply science, technology, and innovation to actually make sure that we do meet the targets for SDGs, but you only have 15 years to do that.
Wow. Right, Kariuki, thank you for painting a very bleak picture of how things are. But I'm hoping that at the end of this conversation, we'll have a better view of things and come up with interventions that will likely take us there. But let's just bring in Roger. Roger, the work that you do obviously comes, he mentioned about funding and capacity building. Please speak to that as we try and look at how then do we foster a culture of research and innovation.
Sure. I mean, as the Gates Foundation, we obviously have founders, both Bill and Melinda and Warren Buffett, who believe strongly in technology and how technology can be applied to solve market failures or other problems that hold low-income people back. And that spans the breadth in our work, both from the health systems, both on neglected diseases, new diagnostics, new treatments from malaria to HIV, to areas that I oversee around ag innovation and ag technology, which I think are incredibly important here on the continent, water and sanitation, where we focus a lot on investments in reinventing the toilet and how that actually works in a non-sewered, more appropriate, sustainable way, to financial inclusion, where Africa has really led the world in using digital innovation to drive financial inclusion and have gone from worldwide leveraging off of early work here in Africa in the last 5 years, from 60 million people through mobile money to 500 million people. So there are innovations that are going on, but we as a foundation try and catalyze those in key areas. And I think, as we just heard, the importance of both basic investment in science on the continent is critical, and also the applied work of the private sector is important, and we try and span that group. So, for example, we do a lot around new seed varieties. Ag productivity is half on the continent of what it is in the rest of the world. And how do we get the right varieties in the right hands? and that's both through conventional breeding, but also biotechnology. And that's done with local partners, local scientists, but there's probably not a sufficient amount graduating in the STEM space, and especially women, who I think we need to make sure that we emphasize on the continent, because that actually is a huge dividend that we may be under-leveraging.
Right. Let me just bring in Croatia and address the women question, because you already had a go at that. How do we make it attractive for women? And not just attractive, how do you make it work for them?
Yeah. So, as we think about laying the groundwork, it's important to note, as I'm an eternal optimist, that we're not starting de novo. So when we say we have less than 1%, it's not like we have 0% investment. So I just wanted to say that. The second is that Africa is very active in contributing to knowledge generation, but not leading knowledge generation. And I think this is where leadership is important. Who makes decisions? What are the questions that are asked? And in Africa, we have a lot of female-headed households. And women are at the coalface in terms of knowing what the challenges are, what needs to be addressed. And we've got to move away from women behind the scenes, implementing, to women actually leading decisions. So, this panel is one of the better gender-represented panels that I've seen in the past couple of days, but we've got to do better. And women think differently. And if we want to shift the center of gravity in terms of how we go to knowledge-based economies, women have to be here in this decision-making process, determining and defining what are the critical questions. Now, science is also a very slow process, and breakthroughs and game-changing innovations don't happen overnight. They take at least a decade. So when you're laying the groundwork, you have to think not just about money, but you have to think about investments in strategic human resources. And here again, there's an opportunity to make sure that we have better gender balance, but that people also need infrastructure and space. So when we look at funding and funding models, they typically focus on projects and define things. And define things happen if you already have a platform. In Africa, that platform is there, but needs to be strengthened. There are centers of excellence, there are institutions. How do we expand that? How do we do better? But underlying and overarching is, what is the culture of science? So I always am stunned if I travel to parts of Europe particularly, that you have these events where you have active citizen involvement. And if we want science to be valued, if we want innovation and discovery to be valued, we need to be demystifying these ideas, and people use the products of innovation and discovery, take it for granted. But we've got to make science more accessible, demystified, but also where the citizens can be actively involved in creating this evidence-based culture, so that they can also influence how their tax money is used and what is prioritized in terms of investments.
Right. I wanted to push back, but I'll get back to your question just a bit. I'd like us to hear Iqbal, as you make your opening remarks, and just give us some sense of what is already happening in the field in which you do operate.
I think firstly I want to make a point that I agree there needs to be more women in science, I think for genetic reasons. I just read a study, quite a reputable one, which said that that of intelligence which is inherited is actually inherited from the women and not from the men. So, so quite.
So if your kid is not doing well in school, you know where they got that.
So intelligence is actually passed on via the X chromosomes.
Right.
And it's quite a reputable study. So yeah, so I think we definitely need more women to be participating in this space. But I think one of the, so I'm in the private, I'm a scientist, I'm a doctor, but I'm also in the business sector, and I firmly believe that Africa can make a quantum leap in terms of the two critical criteria of progress and performance if we are prepared to embrace science and technology And what's in our favor, as opposed to many other parts of the world, is that we have incredible young talent on the continent, a talent that's hungry to be educated, both formally and informally, hungry to embrace new technologies. And it's often the case that when you don't have the existing infrastructure, I always give the example of many mobile companies have invested heavily in infrastructure, but all geared towards voice. Whereas today, data is literally 90% of the traffic that occurs. So much cheaper forms of infrastructure can be utilized to embrace data. But I think maybe we don't have to take the view as Africans that we can't lead. I mean, innovation doesn't have a limit because we all have the same talent. Yes, there is an issue of experience, institutional memory, institutional support base, etc. So what we have to do is create and in the private sector, which we have done very successfully, is create creative labs within our organization. So one of the things I was saying earlier, in fact, in our pre-panel discussion, was that we reached a tipping point, a couple of years back, in terms of the investment in science and technology. And what do I mean by that? Until then, it was actually very difficult to get the people, to motivate them. And so a lot of expats have come back to work for us, and we're employing about 115,000 people, of which a third are graduates and professionals across 40 countries. So initially, it was very difficult to convince people to come back, to convince people to look at the careers, because they wanted to know, is there a career pathway, is there job security, is there an ability to be able to realize their dream of becoming an innovation leader in science and technology. And it took us a while to build up that kind of credibility. And of course, the other big thing is, do you have the financial resources to see?
Pour pouvoir mener à bien votre plan en termes de cet engouement pour l'innovation scientifique et technologique, plus particulièrement dans le secteur privé. Donc ça nous a pris pas mal de temps et nous avons dû passer par plusieurs étapes. La première étape a été de convaincre nos interlocuteurs que cette stratégie était à long terme. Et deuxièmement, la sécurité de leur emploi, l'espace pour innover. Et troisièmement, l'espace de créer de la valeur pour eux-mêmes du point de vue d'être un entrepreneur. Et dernier point, de montrer comment tout ceci se conjugue. Et ce parcours est un parcours très spécial pour nous, et pour moi en tout cas. Moi, j'ai une formation de scientifique, et il est formidable de voir qu'il est possible de créer un espace pour les entrepreneurs scientifiques. Et ce n'est pas chaque scientifique qui est un entrepreneur, mais il y a certains scientifiques qui ont cette vocation, qui veulent désirer des entrepreneurs. Il y en a d'autres qui travaillent pour nous, que nous employons parce qu'ils veulent uniquement être des scientifiques. Le dernier point que j'aimerais communiquer, qu'il est
globally, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Wellcome and others that are supporting science, and especially early stage science. And it's also great that there are governments, and I know in South Africa, our government in particular has been a great supporter of public-private sector partnerships in the science space. But I think there needs to be a lot more.
Right.
A lot more co-investment, co-participation, and not just in the early stages, because to scale the impact of science and technology, you actually need much bigger investment.
Right.
And that's, I think, the next step for us as Africans is to work out how do we get the funding to be able to scale our sort of investments in the area of science and technology.
Right. And well, you've preempted quite a few things that I wanted to bring out. But before that, Koresha made a very important point that Africa has been for a long time consuming knowledge that they do not generate. And as I bring in Dr. Oni, and probably the youngest doctor on the panel today, yes, I can confirm that. Kariuki made a very important point. We're talking about Africa's future here. And if we're to innovate for the future, then the people who will be there need to be part of this conversation. Oni, how do you make innovation and research as a culture sexy for young people?
Thanks. I think there's two aspects, right? So I think we're talking about existing scientists, and we're talking about future scientists. So in thinking about that pipeline, so if we think about existing scientists first, just to build on Koresha's point about gender, we need to move beyond this two-staged approach that we need to attract women into science, and then we need to build them for leadership. We need to rethink. It's not two separate things. We can't afford to say, no, we'll just get them in first, and then we'll work out the leadership thing later. I think we're beyond that point. So how do we attract women into science in ways that set them on a path to leadership? And that really speaks to career pathing. And I think we're focused on attracting for so long, and I think it's important, and we still have a lot of work to do there, but I think to some extent it's been at the detriment to retaining and rewarding, so that we're actually looking at the pathing and examining what are the barriers to women scientists staying within science and also becoming leaders in science. So I think that's a very important point to make. The second point relates to particularly early and mid-career scientists now. I think things are changing in terms of how people engage and their perspective on the role of science. My experience is that early and mid-career science, they're thirsty, they're hungry to engage, they're hungry to promote the importance of science in society. People are over and above what they're meant to be doing, reaching out and engaging. So there's the Young Academy movement across the continent. Ask yourself if you know whether your country has a Young Academy, and if you're in that space, ask yourself what you're doing to support them, because they're doing phenomenal work in raising the profile of science, in really engaging people and trying to showcase the face of science, because we all remember how we were taught science. I always think that, or STEM, when I say science, I mean the broadest term. I love mathematics, and I always think that if I was taught it differently, I would have gone into that. I just did medicine instead, which is a bit of a second prize, I guess. But at the time, I just didn't see the relevance. It just wasn't taught in a way that was relevant. It was just something that was, okay, I'm good at it, it's kind of interesting, but there's no relevance to this.
Right.
And I always think if I knew that what I know now from colleagues like Yababal and people who are doing interesting work at the Ames Institute with applying mathematics, I would have been in a different story. So what are we doing in teaching science? I think we have a huge gap in generating that passion for STEM in schools. One aspect of that is doing it as an extracurricular thing, and I think there are a lot of initiatives on that. Right. But as a curricular thing, what are we doing? Why are we not getting our most passionate scientists to teach?
Right.
We have, I don't know if this exists, and I'm about to go on sabbatical, so I'm not saying I'm going to do this right now, but why have we ever had and I'd be interested to know, a teaching sabbatical, where as a scientist you take a year out and you spend it teaching? Because my engagement with school learners is that when they see the passion with which you speak, it's not just the content, it's how you teach it. And when they see how you engage and what you do, it entirely changes their perspective on the content. So I think we need to think about ways to institutionalize and to institutionalize that engagement. And I think that is key to building that pipeline.
Right. Thanks, Oni. And you've brought very important points. I certainly didn't like how math was taught to me, so we're in the same boat. But more importantly, I mean, even listening to the scene setting of my panelists here, there are things that came out very clearly that probably we need to explore. And I'd like just to prod in a little bit deeper. How then do we make R&D a culture? How do we build this capacity? Whether you're in corporate, whether in academia, how do we make it an everyday part of our lives? Because we are all agreeing that yes, we've been consuming a lot of information, but it's time Africa generated this information. How then do we create this culture? Kariuki.
I mean, there's no doubt that there is a whole pool of young people to tap into to really create a thriving culture for science, technology, innovation in Africa. And that's what we are doing in a very practical way. What we are doing is making investments, we and our partners, that actually are addressing those issues. So if you take some of the things we are doing at the Academy, we are, with our partners, investing, like in South Africa, we're investing at Wits University, for example, in a medical biostatistics program that is attracting young people to take up medical biostatistics as a career option and take them through the pipeline of development from when they do their MSCs to then they go do their PhDs. At UKZN, we have a big program there funded with our partners, the Wellcome Trust and DFID, to look at issues of HIV and TB development. You can go across to Zimbabwe. Mental health is a neglected issue in Africa. There is a program there for mental health in a country that has probably less than 20 psychiatrists. What are the innovative ways you can do to actually provide mental care in a country like that? And this is, true of Zimbabwe, but it's also true of any other country. Right. So very practical things you can do. In Cote d'Ivoire, there's a One Health program there looking at the interface between animal and human health. In Bamako, in Dakar, we are doing malaria, including malaria genomics. Genomics is an important part of what we need to be doing in Africa. We are the most diverse continent in the world, yet we know very little about our genetic makeup. We like calling one another my brother, my sister, but actually, we don't have a clue about how related we are to one another. And you might be surprised the guy who really phenotypically looks very close to you could be very, very genetically diverse. And so, but this is important from the perspective of disease susceptibility, disease pathogenesis, as well as how actually pharmacogenomics, how we react to medicines, right. Especially for those who are involved in clinical practice, you know very well that there always will be a population of people who react adversely to drugs, and we need to understand a little bit more about this. These are practical things that draw in young people to get excited, because every young person needs a few things. They need a decent level of education, they need an opportunity, and of course they need good health. Creating the opportunities for young people to actually be problem solvers. This is what all our programs need to be doing, and this is what, at a very practical way, we are doing at AISA. This week, what we have been doing here is to really try and bring more partners into this mix. And so, we've said governments are not really fully engaged with driving this, so we need more government. And Ikubo is here as a representative of the private sector. We've been trying to get the private sector through this coalition, we are calling the Coalition for African Research and Innovation, to come on board, because we need all hands on deck if we are going to really move this agenda forward. We want philanthropists from the continent to begin to do what Ikubo and other philanthropists are doing. I understand there are 20, 30 billionaires. I know Africans, we are very guarded about our wealth. So maybe they are more like that. So we need them to actually invest in supporting science in Africa. So very practical ways to move the agenda forward.
Let me just push back a little bit, Kariuki. It's almost as if there's a template when you're talking about improving what is already there in regards to academia, in regards to scientists. But as a culture on the corporate scene, we do not have a culture of R&D. We do not have a culture of how do we make our decision? That's what I'm gunning at. And how do we improve this? Karisha, I see you nodding your head. You may want to jump into this. It's not just for the scientist, but for a lot of people here who are running businesses. How do we make evidence-based decision-making a part of our lives?
So I wanted to make a slightly different point in terms of how do we create this culture. So on April 22nd, in different parts of the world, people marched. It's a different type of march. We know the importance of marching. Usually it's marching protest type marches. But this was a march for something, which was a march for science. And right here in the city, we participated as one of the cities and that took part in the March for Science. And I learned a few things in that March for Science. So firstly, it was 5 institutions, mainly academic, and also primarily focused on research. And we gathered outside the City Hall, which is about 2 blocks down, on a Saturday morning. And if you're in the city on a Saturday morning, it's just teeming with people coming in to do their shopping. And it also happened to be one of those last Saturdays where parents would bring their children. We had all these wonderful posters about scientific breakthroughs, the importance of science, and without fail, as the parents were rushing through the front of the City Hall, the kids were pulling their parents back and really excited. Can we stop and talk to these people? Because we also had science. You know, I'm a scientist, my name is so-and-so, ask me about this. And we had a diversity of scientists represented. And I think it was one of the most powerful things. We also had a mobile lab there. And if you think about alchemy, Tanya, who ran this, had these kids eating out of her hands. And within minutes, we had a large group of people. And so we went back. That was a one-day event. How do we build on that one-day event? And I think that was more powerful. It certainly was picked up by the media. And I've been spending, and the partner organizations, the past 2 weeks, just, you know, popularizing science, demystifying it, getting people to appreciate all the things they take for granted.
Right.
And also, it's about sharing what is the scientific method. How do you think, when you're inundated with information, how do you tease out fake news from fact and evidence? And for example, one of the big threats we have, humanity has advanced immensely because of vaccines. And because of fake news, there are large numbers of highly educated people not immunizing their infants.
Right.
And so not only are their children being put under threat, but they're putting other children under threat and threatening the gains that we've had in terms of child survival. So as we think about big issues and, you know, fourth revolutions and so on, they're basic things that we need to address. And this is a very critical time where we're inundated with information. And if the citizens don't understand it, at the end of the day, most of the investments are from governments, and people whose taxes go into government to deliver programs need to have a right to influence how those resources are used.
Right.
They have a right to ensure accountability, responsibility, minimizing and eliminating corruption, because it's not like our governments don't have money. It's how do they choose to use that money? And when my heart weeps when I look around Africa and see all the wars, the conflicts, the displacement of people, and who's getting rich from that? It's the people who are making arms, and yet, and our governments are putting money into purchasing things where there isn't real threat.
Right.
And we are we're making the wrong decisions, and if we have an informed citizenry, we certainly should be able to use that power to influence how limited resources are used for the right things that advance humanity rather than destroy it.
Right. And we'll revisit the question of how do governments prioritize this, and not just government, even corporates. But Oni, you want to come in?
I just want to build on the point of culture. Thanks for bringing up the March for Science. I think when we think about what the culture and what are we trying to achieve, and for me, I think the end goal would be another March for Science where everybody is marching for science, not scientists marching for science. And I think that is what we're trying to get to. If we think about gender marches, is we moved from women marching for gender equality to everybody marching for gender equality. So I think from a cultural perspective, how do we move into a position where everybody, the broader public thinks, oh, there's a March for Science. Yes, that's something I'm keen to support. And I think that engagement of scientists in regular societal function is really important. I think historically we've been a little bit set back and just, oh, this has got nothing to do with me, and we wait till the fake news comes up and then we criticize it, but when we're asked about it, oh no, we're too busy to engage. And so how do we move from responding to emergencies or responding to particular adversity, if you like, to routine engagement. Because I think that builds that social license that we need with society. I think science and society is a problematic statement because it almost implies that science is not part of society. So the science in society is because scientists are part of society. So how can we actually think about our role in society and apply that on a more routine basis is one aspect. And I think the other aspect is the science policy engagement. Because then also, how do we routinely engage with the process of decision-making or the people who make the decisions and those processes, and to engage with our scientific knowledge on that, and that there's some initiatives going on this, because I think one of the key challenges is the capacity. How many scientists know how to do that? How many scientists know about the science advice or science policy structures within their countries?
Right.
So one of the initiatives that's going on at the moment, we've got an African chapter of the International Network for Government Science Advice that has actually been training, particularly focused on earlier career scientists, just about that policy landscape and some of the challenges and thinking through these processes of policy engagement in science.
Right, and it's all becoming clear that this is not just a money problem, right? There's a behavioral aspect to it where it's a culture change that we're trying to bring in. Roger, I'd just like to bring you in very quickly to address the question of the non-financial support mechanisms that we can set up to bring in R&D, and then I'll open the session to the audience.
Look, I think that I hesitate when we talk about science and we talk about Africa to use the word culture. And the reason being because it makes it seem like, well, there's something in African culture that keeps us from being scientific, right? But if we look at the history of innovation around the world, it doesn't happen in isolated places of someone in a laboratory by themselves. Every once in a while that happens, but most of it happens when you have this liquid exchange of ideas. And having spent most of my career in Malawi and Zambia, you know, in the northern part of Zambia, there was a lot of isolation of communities and a lot of just highly embedded, repetitive ties of information that weren't really broad and disconnected, where you got new information that allowed innovation, where new technology meets new business models that drive new thinking. And what we've seen with the explosion of the internet and connectivity is that accelerating even on the continent here. And so there are a number of innovation labs going on in Kenya right now that are doing some incredible work that range from a MasterCard lab in financial inclusion, one of the first in the world outside of the North, IBM lab, where there are distinguished engineers of African background who are now there, to health labs, the African Agriculture Technology, also in Kenya, which is focused on water efficient maize for Africa, that are new varieties to address real problems that people interact with every day. And we are seeing, as those come together, new solutions coming out of the continent that probably wouldn't have been possible 25 years ago. Right. And the cool and exciting thing around that is young people are deeply engaged in it. And I actually am really hopeful that this is going to continue to accelerate out. So I would say there was a structural component to it. There's a financial component to it. And then there is this sense of having familiarity with science, of it not the thing out there, but it's the thing I interact with all the time.
Right.
So I just want us to not say, look, this is a change in culture that has to occur, but how do we drive the right infrastructure and the right policy and the right financing that actually lets the brilliance that exists really show up?
Right. Very quickly, Iqbal.
Yeah, I think a couple of important points. The first is that we must simplify things. We must demystify science. And people do things for non-financial reasons. The first is they must have a sense of purpose, you know, and they must be passionate about it. And importantly, they must be solving a problem, a concern. Just a quick story. You know, I was a fourth-year medical student, and I know some of you won't believe this, but I was a really good soccer player.
It's hard to believe.
Many years ago. So in my fourth year in my community health block, because I was black in South Africa and black people played on soccer fields which were really gravel, no grass, etc., lots of holes, etc. White people played on green grass, you know, the few that did play soccer, a lot of people played rugby, is that I saw a lot of injuries in the black communities and amongst my friends that played with me in the teams, and talented people got, you know, severely injured. So I decided to do a survey on the number of injuries amongst the black and white soccer fields. That was in my 4th year. And of course I found that amongst the black soccer fields principally in the townships, there were at least 30, 40 times more injuries than on the white soccer fields. But that wasn't really good science, it was more of a survey. When I got to, after my medical degree, I did sports science and sports medicine, and the fields had not improved either. So I then decided to, and by then, lots of people, you know, I was probably the only doctor or medical student amongst all the soccer players. And because soccer is a working class sport. And so I was always fixing knees and ankles and shoulders, and I was like the resident doctor. But the thing is that a lot of people got injured due to these potholes. And then I decided, you know, enough is enough. I'm going to do something which is to solve this problem. So I can't solve the problem of the holes in the ground, because that's a government problem, it's a funding problem. But I'm going to see if I can prevent the injuries by actually designing from scratch an ankle brace, which was affordable, by the way, to the majority. And I ended up addressing all the soccer clubs, all the people. There were, I think it was a couple of thousand people in my study. I then designed this brace, and I was able to show scientifically, and I got everyone involved, and all the soccer players all over the peninsula that were principally black were involved, and we monitored if the brace prevented the injuries versus those who did not wear it, and of course it was dramatic.
Right.
The point is that this became one of the most widely quoted scientific studies in the world, in the American Journal of Sports Medicine. It still remains a reference thing. The ankle brace I made no money out of it except for the university that I was aligned to, but it made the company that took my design, a $100 million company in the US, in New Jersey. I mean, I got the gold medal for sports science research, but the point is that
he's just saying it in passing, eh?
Yeah, everybody benefited from that. I demystified the science. I made it exciting, and you know, we solved a very serious problem. And I think that's what we need to do.
We need to simplify things.
We need to simplify and solve problems, and we need to be passionate, and we need to involve people that are not scientists in what we're doing.
Right. Iqbal, allow me to just open the session to the panel. Our time is fast spent, so just take one question very quickly. There's a microphone coming to you. Let's start with the gentleman there. Tell us your name and just one question, and who in the panel you'd like to address your question.
Okay. So my name is Siab Balfantai. I'm from the African Institute of Mathematical Science in Cape Town. So I think I would like everyone to address this question, so I don't have a specific person. So in the discussion, there is the financial component and then the cultural component. But one thing that I actually also think is very important is the psychological component, where role modeling is what is very important. At least personally, I'm from a mathematical background, and if I look into the world and just see like, okay, I'm trying to be the leader in this field, not just in Africa, but just to be, you know, in the world cutting edge research, then I see the number of people I can count who probably would be in that area is just very limited.
Right.
So you always have this baggage in the background where, like, am I going to be like that? And then the other component, the psychological, if I'm like playing, so science is a complicated field, but if I'm like running, I will be always thinking about winning. So just there is going to be always in the background, if I'm from West Africa and I'm playing football, from the childhood, I would be always just thinking, you know, to be big and playing in a very big field. If I'm running, it's going to be like my target would be very high. So how can we introduce that, like in the scientific sense, and so that, you know, like people from Africa and Kenya would just think like science as running, I mean,
Right.
it's complicated or like that. So how can we introduce a psychological component in such a way that we always think to be the leader, not just to be good?
All right. I will kindly ask Kariuki to respond to that, but before you do that, kindly let's take the next question. Right here.
So I'm from Singapore, and in the 60s, Singapore's GDP is the same as Kenya, and today is one of the highest in the world. And I saw that the asset here is the young people. I met with a lot of young global leaders and shapers who feel very confident. And what we need to do is to convert the mentality of a donation charity model into a social business model. And if we can take all the Schwab Fellows best practice model, they already got all the innovation. So if we think about innovation, we should think about what to do with the ones that are already innovated,
Right.
rather than to forget about this and innovate new ones,
Right.
which is untried. And if we can use all the assets that already exist, even inside the World Economic Forum, the philanthropies, the multinational, the Schwab Fellows, and the energy of the young people, plus the public policy that came from Singapore that is replicated, let's say in Rwanda, I think we can solve this problem. So I'd like to offer myself as a part of the solution,
Right.
to aggregate all these communities into a school of gumption, where you see solution rather than see problems.
Fantastic. Right. Thank you for that comment, and the scientists in this room will take you up on that offer. Let's have one question, because his was a comment, and then we'll come back to the panel for their summations. Anyone who wants to go on one question? Going once, twice? Okay. Kariuki, he brought up a very important point of, yes, there's a lot of scientists out there, but they need someone to hold their hands. They need someone to look up to. Please.
Well, on the psychological aspects of it, I guess this ties with what Toru was talking about, the need for us to start nurturing people from a very early stage and to take them through the system and really learn what it is that they need for them to succeed later on in life. You know, the final product is only as good as the pipeline and the nurturing that happens at very early stages in our education system. So I totally agree with that aspect, and I think that's where we can address all these issues, include the psychological issues. The fact of the matter, though, is that we have very few mentors on the continent. And again, it's going to take a bit of time for us to build up to the sort of ratio of mentors to mentees that actually would be transformative. But again, this is where we need very good collaborations with the North, because there is a lot of benchmarking we need to do. There is an opportunity for us to continue actually having major collaborations. Many of our programs, especially when you are looking at junior postdocs and asking the question, how do you transform a junior postdoc into an independent researcher? The fact is, they actually need to have very strong mentorship. Right. And the challenge we have in Africa is that the few mentors who are really good. So what happens? They get overwhelmed by demand, the number of students they have to actually mentor. So we need collaborations, both intra-African as well as with the North and the West and the Australia and wherever else, to actually do this together. But we have to structure this in a way that these people actually get that mentorship and support with their feet firmly in Africa. Because again, we don't want to lose people. I know we are not supposed to be politically correct about talking about brain drain. We're supposed to talk about brain recirculation.
Go ahead.
But you know, if you are a central banker sitting at a central bank of South Africa, you'll be very happy about the number of remittances that are being done by the diaspora, and probably you want them to remain where they are. If you are a vice chancellor of a university who has spent meager resources to train X number of PhDs, and then only to see them pack their bags and go away, it is a brain drain for you as a university vice chancellor. So there is a context in which we also have to address these issues to make sure that we are not losing the best scientists and innovators from the continent.
Right. Oni wants to jump in very quickly?
I just want to build on that to speak about the mentorship and also a little bit around the mobility. So I have a story from a Nigerian colleague who said he attended the retirement party of a professor of biochemistry who, you know, in the speech to introduce him said, You know, he was the founding biochemist, set up this division, did this fantastic work, and you know, is the only person that has mastered this fantastic technique. And there was applause. And he thought, the first thing we need to do is take away the fact that that was something to admire. Because if you haven't managed to transfer your knowledge and your ability, and you're retiring, and you're still the only person that has mastered it, that is problematic.
Right.
And I think that exemplifies a lot of the mentoring problems that we have across the continent. It's just, there is just, oh, I can do it, and I leave, right? So that's, I think, a really important point. I think just to speak on the mobility,
Sure.
and maybe disagree a little bit, because to add on to the question earlier around the psychological aspects, I think sometimes when we talk about mobility, we think about it in terms of funding either to train elsewhere or funding to return, and we don't focus on the psychosocial support that's needed. So just a little story. I was at the Science Forum South Africa meeting, which is an annual meeting with the Department of Science and Technology. If you haven't been, it's amazing. And I was at a panel, I was attending a session of early mid-career scientists talking about the experiences returning. And there was a scientist who was talking about her experiences going to do her PhD in the States. And some of the challenges that she faced and how she struggled through it, et cetera. She was highlighting the importance of mentorship and how she had a good mentor, et cetera. But one of the things that she mentioned that really struck me was she said that in meeting other PhD students not from the States, one of the things that was really striking for her was that her Chinese counterparts got a phone call or an email about once a month from home, from the department of, or their research foundation, to say, hey, how's your studies going, how's this going, etc., and just kept in touch. So when this study is finished, it's like, so, about coming back, so they kept in touch. And I think we often think about it in terms of you go and train, and then there's people out there and we bring them back. So how do we actually, because somebody mentioned about the importance of exchange of ideas, and I think it's important to move around, even
Right.
within the continent, to foster innovation and development of ideas.
Right.
But I think we need to think beyond just the funding to that psychosocial support from the word go, keeping in touch with them, and not relying just on sentimentality to
Right.
return.
Right. So write home, email, send letters, SMSs. They need it. Gentlemen, we just have under 4 minutes. I'd like to give a closing comment to Iqbal, Carisha, and Roger to take a minute each to give your closing comment so that I have a minute also to sum up.
So just to reaffirm the point which I made earlier, which is that it must be about purpose. And it's not about money. It's about really trying to make a difference and trying to make an impact and trying to be successful, all critical motivating factors for purpose. If we can engender that kind of culture, then I think we'll build the science capacity, the STEM capacity for Africa.
Thank you. Carisha?
So 2 points. The first is that I think we achieve a lot when we work together. And I made a point at the beginning about African leadership in terms of knowledge generation. And I want to return to that because there's a difference in terms of what we can achieve, how quickly we can achieve through strategic partnerships. So I want to foster that collaboration, building on Ani's point, which is that, you know, the more we work together to solve common problems, the more we can achieve that. The second is that we really need to inculcate a culture that moves away from government dependence and entitlements. A few weeks ago in South Africa, we had a major crisis that's been brewing for a little while, where something like 20 million of the 55 million people are dependent on some type of social grant. And we really have to move away from that to say, as individuals within this country with immense opportunity, how do I become an architect of my own destiny? And that kind of entrepreneurship, the one about I can do this and seize those opportunities, is something that's going to be really critical for transformation, I think.
Roger?
I would just say two things, and I think building on the points that were made, which are really good. If you look at the great achievements that's been done in primary education growth and secondary education growth, there's been real achievement on the continent in the last couple decades. But there is a tremendous drop-off to the first job and to university education. And that's especially true for women. And so I think we need to actually create the right kind of channels to move people into both jobs and into university so that they can actually begin to be productive in that area. The second is that to the idea of making science really available and tangible, there are real issues of climate change, of productivity needs, where there are issues that only people on the continent that are going to be able to address them because they'll understand it in new and special ways. And so I think we need public policy and institutions that are going to invest in the institutions that exist to actually drive solutions on the continent and connect them to international institutions. And the architecture, as we heard, is there. What I don't see is the commitment in a public policy to operationalize that into real on-the-ground, both funding and technology transfer. And I think so we need a public policy role as well as we need the more and greater connectedness.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to all my panelists. I'd like to very quickly run through a few thoughts that have sprung out in the course of the 60 minutes we spent speaking here. And one is that there is already work that is being done. So we're not reinventing the wheel. We just need to build up on what we already have. Also, it's very clear that it's not always about the money, right? It has been painted as a money issue. It's not always about the money. There are a lot of other silent issues that may be there that we do not talk about. Mentorship and support is indeed a key ingredient in this. If we're to create this culture, then we need to offer support to those of us who've already stepped out. Commitment in the public policy is also very much needed if indeed there's going to be partnerships between government and the organizations that run this. And finally, it is time that Africa generated its own information and knowledge. We've read a lot of information passed on to the continent. I think it's time that Africa became a knowledge generator. Ladies and gentlemen, that marks the end of this conversation where we try to explore how to build these ecosystems. It is our hope that as you head back to your areas of influence, you light other smaller fires that will trigger these conversations. Thank you very much.